There is a certain kind of silence that happens right after someone raises their voice in a meeting and gets exactly what they wanted. Nobody claps, nobody objects, people just look down at their notes and quietly adjust. I noticed that silence a long time ago, and it never stopped bothering me. It wasn't the shouting that interested me, it was the compliance that followed it, almost automatic, almost rehearsed. Somewhere underneath that small moment was something much older than any office or any argument. I started paying closer attention to people who always seemed to need the final word. Not people who simply had opinions, but people who needed the room to bend toward them. At first, I explained it the easy way, the way most of us do. I told myself, some people are just naturally dominant, wired that way since childhood, and that's the end of the story. But that explanation stopped satisfying me the more I watched, because dominance on its own doesn't explain why some of these people seem exhausted by their own need to control everything around them. He walks into a room and immediately starts measuring it. Who is in charge here? Who might challenge him? Where does he need to stand to be noticed first? He does this so quickly that he probably doesn't even realize he's doing it anymore. It has become instinct, like checking a mirror before leaving the house. He isn't necessarily loud. Sometimes he's the quiet one who somehow still ends up making every final decision without ever seeming to ask for that role. You may have worked for someone like this. Maybe you've sat across a dinner table from someone like this. A parent who always had to be right, even about small things that didn't matter. A boss who needed credit for every idea, even the ones he barely touched. Maybe you started wondering, the way I did, why does someone need this much control over things that aren't actually threatening him? That question sat with me for a while, because on the surface it doesn't make sense. If someone already has status, income, respect, why do they still need to dominate a conversation about where to eat dinner? Why correct a spouse in front of guests over something as small as a mispronounced word? Why does winning still feel necessary when there was nothing at stake to begin with? That contradiction is where the real story begins. The simple explanation, the one most people settle for, is confidence. We tell ourselves that powerful people are simply more confident than the rest of us.
But confidence doesn't usually need an audience to prove itself. Confidence doesn't flinch when it's ignored. What I started noticing instead was something closer to hunger, a hunger that never quite gets fed, no matter how much power arrives. He gets the promotion, and within weeks he's already eyeing the next title. He wins the argument, and somehow he brings it up again a week later, just to remind everyone he won. That's the part that surprised me the most. Power for these people rarely feels like an arrival. It feels like a temporary relief from something else entirely, something quieter, something they may not even be consciously aware of. And once I started looking for that something else, I began seeing it everywhere, hiding just underneath the confidence. Think about the coworker who has to correct every small mistake in a meeting, even ones that don't affect the outcome. Watch closely and you'll notice his correction isn't really about accuracy. It's about being seen as the one who catches things others miss. Watch the neighbor who always needs to know more about the property lines, the zoning rules, the homeowners association bylaws, not because he particularly loves rules, but because knowing more means having leverage nobody else has. Small leverage in a small neighborhood, but leverage all the same. At first, this looks like ordinary competitiveness, until you notice how uncomfortable he becomes the moment someone else knows something he doesn't. Not annoyed exactly, something closer to unsettled, like the ground briefly shifted under him. That tiny reaction explains far more than any dramatic display of authority ever could, because real confidence can survive not knowing something. Whatever he's protecting can't. Little by little, a pattern started forming in my mind. People who chase power obsessively often aren't chasing power for its own sake. They're chasing the feeling that comes right before someone can reject them, dismiss them, or make them feel small again. Power becomes a shield they built sometime earlier in life, usually without choosing to build it consciously. And shields, by definition, exist because something once got through. I thought about the men I'd known who grew up needing to prove themselves at the dinner table just to get a word in. Adult children still competing for a parent's approval decades later, still measuring their success against the siblings, still needing to mention the promotion within the first 5 minutes of a phone call home. Nobody forced them to keep competing, but something inside them never quite believed the competition was over. Maybe you've seen this in a marriage. One partner who has to have the last word in every disagreement, not because the disagreement matters, but because losing feels like disappearing. Maybe you've seen it after retirement, when a man who spent 30 years being addressed as sir suddenly finds himself invisible at the grocery store, and something in him quietly panics.
He starts correcting the cashier's math just to feel relevant again. It isn't really about the math. That's when a new question started forming. If power is really about protection, what exactly is being protected? And the answer, once I let myself sit with it, wasn't flattering. Underneath the hunger for control is usually a very old fear of being unimportant. Not unimportant to the world exactly, but unimportant to the specific people whose opinion once mattered enormously. A father who withheld approval. A childhood where attention had to be earned through performance, never given freely. A small-town culture where a man's worth was measured entirely by what he could provide or command. He learned early, maybe without ever putting it into words, that being liked wasn't reliable, but being obeyed was. Obedience doesn't abandon you the way affection sometimes does. If people follow your lead, you don't have to wonder whether they actually care about you. You just have to keep leading. That's a much safer emotional bargain for someone who was disappointed before and doesn't want to feel that particular disappointment again. This is where the pieces really started clicking together for me. Every small habit I'd noticed before suddenly made more sense. The need to be right in unimportant arguments, the discomfort with not knowing something, the compulsion to remind people of past wins, all of it traces back to the same unconscious fear, the fear of mattering less than he needs to matter. Power isn't the goal anymore at that point. Power is simply the evidence he uses to reassure himself that the fear isn't true, at least for today. And this explained something that puzzled me for a long time, which is why powerful people so rarely feel satisfied by their power. A shield doesn't need to feel good, it needs to keep working. So the moment one victory stops proving anything, another one becomes necessary. That's why the promotion isn't enough. That's why winning the argument once isn't enough. The reassurance fades fast because it was never really about the argument or the promotion in the first place. You may recognize a version of this in church committees, in weekend softball leagues, in the way certain men at the barbershop always seem to steer the conversation back toward themselves. It isn't arrogance in the simple sense, it's maintenance. Constant, quiet maintenance of a feeling that keeps threatening to slip away. And once you notice it in one place, you start noticing it almost everywhere. In military reunions, where rank still seems to matter decades later. In family gatherings, where an uncle needs to remind everyone what he built. In phone calls that always somehow circle back to what he's accomplished. What surprised me even more was realizing this doesn't only show up as dominance, sometimes it hides inside generosity. A man who insists on paying for everyone's dinner every single time, refusing to let anyone else contribute. On the surface, that looks like kindness. Underneath it, sometimes, is the same need.
If he's the one providing, he's the one who matters. If he lets someone else pay, some old fear whispers that his value in the room just quietly dropped. Without realizing it, the people around him start adjusting their behavior to keep him comfortable. They let him finish stories. They defer certain decisions to him, even small ones. not because they respect his judgment more necessarily, but because it's easier than dealing with what happens when he doesn't get his way. And not adjustment, repeated enough times over enough years, becomes its own kind of quiet agreement. Everyone plays along, and the shield stays intact a little longer. Eventually, you start to wonder about the cost of all this, because there always is one. Relationships built around someone's need for control tend to become oddly one-directional. People stop bringing him real problems because his response usually turns into another opportunity to demonstrate authority rather than actually help. Friends stop disagreeing with him not because they agree, but because disagreement takes more energy than it's worth. And somewhere in all of that accommodation, he becomes lonelier, even while appearing more respected than ever. That's the quiet tragedy sitting underneath most of this. The very thing built to protect him from feeling unimportant slowly isolates him from the kind of connection that would have made him feel important in a way that actually lasts. Genuine closeness requires occasionally being wrong in front of someone and surviving it. It requires letting someone else be right sometimes without feeling smaller for it. But if his sense of safety depends on never losing, he can't risk that kind of closeness very often. I think about the men who reach the later chapters of their lives, sitting in a quiet living room surrounded by trophies from decades of winning arguments nobody even remembers anymore, and wonder if any of it filled the space it was supposed to fill. Some of them start to sense it themselves, somewhere around retirement or after a health scare, or when their adult children stop calling as often as they used to. The shield is still standing, technically, but there's nobody left standing close enough to it for it to matter. Maybe you've been watching someone like this for years without quite naming what you were seeing. Maybe a parent, maybe a boss, maybe someone at church who always needs to be the one with the answer. Maybe, and this one is harder to sit with, you've noticed pieces of this pattern in yourself. Not because you're a bad person, but because somewhere along the way, you also learned that being needed felt safer than being loved unconditionally. That recognition doesn't have to feel like an accusation. It can simply be information, the kind that quietly changes how you move through the next conversation. None of this means every ambitious person is secretly afraid, or that every leader is hiding some old wound. Plenty of people pursue achievement out of genuine curiosity or simple enjoyment of a challenge without any of this underneath it. But when the need for control shows up again and again in situations where nothing was actually at risk, it's worth asking a quieter question. Not what does he want to win, but what does he believe will happen if, just once, he doesn't? If this conversation helped explain why control can feel so necessary to some people, the next one picks up almost exactly where this leaves off, exploring what happens to a person's closest relationships once that need for control goes unexamined for 30 or 40 years. It isn't really a new topic, it's the same story, just further down the road. Thank you for spending this time thinking through this with me. If any part of this reminded you of someone you know, or perhaps a version of yourself you hadn't quite named before, I'd genuinely like to know. Here's a question worth sitting with tonight. Whose approval are you still quietly performing for, even now? If this kind of thinking is something you enjoy, consider subscribing because there's a lot more of this ahead.